The viewpoints expressed on Night Fright are not necessarily those of the host, the staff, the sponsors, or the affiliate stations. Tonight's program may contain graphic themes or images. Viewer discretion is advised.
There is a time for question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Showtime. Welcome to the show. Serious subject matter tonight. So get the coffee going, the tea going, or a beverage of your choice going right away. Get in your most comfy chair. The most important thing tonight, folks, keep the lights on. We're going to be looking at serial killers. I'm going to say this often tonight, but I just want to remind you, no children tonight. If the little ones are around, you might want to send them off to bed a little bit earlier, or at least get them out of the room. We're going to be very graphic tonight, and there's no sense exposing to the little ones to this type of talk that we're going to have tonight about the worst of serial killers. Now that these serial killers have, but according to our guest tonight, Elise Torres, who's done extensive research on serial killers, they are our neighbors, they're churchgoers, close friends, parents, and maybe the very person sleeping right next to you, your husband or your wife. You know, folks, fans of the show know I do a lot of shows with some pretty frightening content, from the UFOs to paranormal to real-life conspiracies, but none frighten me more than serial killer shows. The reason for that is because 3 of the worst serial killers in Canada are housed not 2 blocks from me in Canada's maximum security jail, the Kingston Penitentiary. In the film Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal Lecter is brilliantly portrayed as a psychiatrist who has simply stepped outside of human empathy and devours his victims in a feeding frenzy in order to satisfy and some kind of insatiable appetite for murder. In the movie Seven, Kevin Spacey looks to fulfill some quest of his own making based on the Bible's 7 sins, again disconnected from empathy. In both these cases, the serial killers are characterized as brilliant strategists, always steps ahead of the adversaries who are trying to stop them. But is this really true? Is this the case for all serial killers? Or is this just Hollywood's version of suspense? One huge question we're going to be looking at tonight is how serial killers walk amongst us and stay veiled only to reveal themselves as true monsters only after they've been caught. Now, what motivates this bloodlust that they go through? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. Now, once again, a reminder, no children, because we are going to be graphic. Our guest tonight, Elise Torres, is a criminal journalist for Crime Wire. You'll be able to find her connections on www.nightfrightshow.com. Take you right to a spot where you can read an article that she sent to me, and this is why she's a guest. The article unnerved me. Her work has also appeared in Thought Catalog, Bustle, and other publications. Elise, welcome to the show, and I do hope your lights are on.
They are, Brent. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Okay, I have to ask you now, what's a beautiful young woman like yourself interested in these diabolical creatures called serial killers?
Well, they've always been a point of fascination for me. I think that the fact that they can be, as you mentioned earlier, the people that walk amongst us, they can be coworkers, they can be parents, that is so contradictory, right, to what we see portrayed in media. Usually, you have these serial killers who are supervillains or devious and hyper attentive, but in reality, you look at serial killers like Ted Bundy. I mean, he was a charismatic, attractive man, and yet he was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history.
Can we talk a little bit about Ted? And
Absolutely.
I shouldn't call him Ted. I should call him the creature named Ted Bundy. But once again, this guy started out as a human being. I mean, somebody changed his diaper, somebody nursed him. He went to kindergarten, I presume, and went to school. And what happened? When did the chip go off inside his head and blew apart? And all of a sudden, he becomes this creature that just wants to kill.
It's a really strange thing to peg as far as what that shifting moment in a serial killer's biography is, right? Because you look at someone like Ted Bundy, he was raised by his grandparents. He went to the University of Puget Sound over in Washington. He was, by all accounts, someone who could have had a very normal series of life milestones, right? But somewhere along the way, he started displaying those traits of psychopathy and it just shifted. And with Ted Bundy, too, a lot of people kind of pin him as a sociopath, but in fact, he has a lot more traits in common with psychopathy, which involves people who have a very charming personality but are unable to form emotional attachments or feel real empathy. So somewhere along Ted Bundy's biography, he lost or never had that ability to really form deep emotions with others.
Is there any signs we could look to specifically with the Bundy case? When he was younger, perhaps a teacher may have made a note and said, this doesn't play well with others, something along those lines that might stick out above the normal teacher-parent, what's the word I'm looking for? When they have the teacher-parent night, they go over the child's case and things of that nature. Would there be anything that we could look at as some kind of evidence that he was on the wrong track earlier on?
Absolutely. He had some very problematic events occur in his childhood. First and foremost, he had he grew up raised by his grandparents, and there is one account that's pretty well known. He woke up, or he awoke, and
That's good.
A member of his family woke up to see that Ted Bundy, I believe he was young, he was probably around 12 years old at this point. He had gathered knives from the kitchen and was standing in the bedroom, standing in a bedroom, and this family member woke up to find herself surrounded by those knives.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
Gee, thanks. Now I'm not, the next 3 nights of lost sleep, I'm going to thank you every night for that.
I mean, if you can my notes are actually telling me he was 3 years old at this point. So, yeah, 3 years old, which is absolutely alarming because you think of, sure, he might have had a rough childhood, being raised by your grandparents and not having that parental influence is going to be difficult one way or another. But he was 3 years old. And he's taking knives out of the kitchen and surrounding his family member with them. That's very much a red flag.
Yeah, I'd be terrified. I mean, if I had a 3-year-old and they behaved in that sense, I think I'd be down at the hospital right away trying to get him or her assessed to find out what's happened and what's going on. Is there any evidence of child abuse, either emotional, physical, anything like that, by his parents? Not his grandparents?
What I mostly see in research with Ted Bundy is that he was someone who preferred to be alone. He was actually quoted as explaining that he chose to be alone. I feel like he had a lot of issues with his paternity. it was a point that kind of impacted him and perhaps attributed to his desire to stalk and murder and kill, or stalk and murder and torture this series of women, right, that he pursued following. But I mean, his grandparents, it is a fact that his grandmother underwent electroconvulsive therapy, which, I mean, seeing your grandmother working through that condition is probably going to impact you one way or another. But I mean, I can't say there was anything that was super major in Ted Bundy's life that would have made him, you know, become as prolific a murderer as he truly became.
It's, you know, it's strange because I know many, many people that were raised by their grandparents because the divorce rates through the ceiling on both sides of the border for whatever reason, but none of them had ever turned to becoming a serial killer or, you know, acting out their anger in a way that would actually deprive a woman of her life or anything like that. Did he get some kind of sexual fulfillment or some kind of buzz off this that somebody might, I don't know, if they smoked a joint or took a drink or something along those lines would get? Was this his high?
Absolutely. He actually had he actually returned to the scene of his crimes very often. He was a necrophiliac with some of his victims. He decapitated a few of his victims and would actually go back to the bodies, and he would toy with the bodies and perform sexual acts until the bodies deteriorated to the point that he couldn't do that anymore. So he was definitely getting some sort of high or some sort of fulfillment from not just the murders, but also from just returning to his, you know, his trophies. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Is this some kind of control issue that goes through all these serial killers? They feel they don't have control in their own life somehow, and they want to take control and show how powerful and big they are, and this is the ultimate way for them to achieve that?
I think you can definitely make that case. I mean, when you look at serial killers, and the article, it looks at specifically serial killer signatures, right? So with serial killer signatures, it's different from the MO or the method of operation, because a signature is the personal mark or imprint of the offender. It's something that the killer does to serve his or her emotional or physical needs, right? It's all about that deep fantasy. It's something that can vary, but it's something that is ritualistic and something that serial killer has to do in order to achieve that gratification.
And from what I understand, it gets more profound each time. Is that not correct?
Yeah. So this is specifically, I'm thinking of the BTK killer. Right, Dennis Rader. He was someone who was just obviously seeking that control, because he actually would pen these letters and send them to the media and taunt them, which also what Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, would do. But when you have that element of taunting, it's just these serial killers looking for a way to assert their dominance, right? And as the BTK killers, as his kills progressed during his span, though they did feature, I believe he hung two of his victims, so it wasn't always bind, torture, and kill. But the way that it feels as though he approached them became less maybe about what he wanted and more about what the next big push was going to be to get a ton of attention, right?
So it's attention seeking at the same time, is it?
I really do think so. I mean, obviously, there's not a one-size-fits-all serial killer.
And ideally, that's what we're looking for. That's why I do shows like this, so I can somehow feel safe and say, okay, I've got it figured out. I can identify a serial killer, and there's not a chance in hell that I'm ever going to be able to identify a serial killer. Case in point, folks, right here in Canada, we had... there's the biggest Air Force base in Canada, and the colonel that was in charge of that Air Force base, of course, Canadians will know this, his name was Russell Williams. And there's pictures of him saluting the Queen because, you know, he would fly our version of Air Force One around. So he would be, yeah. And all the time he had little girls' underwear on. And he would break into houses and put little girls' underwear on. There's tons of pictures of him on the internet. And he ended up escalating that to kidnapping women, and he killed 2 women. One of them actually worked on his base, and he wrote their parents as commander of her, saying how horrible it was. And this guy was the guy that actually committed the crime. So you never know. Mm-hmm. And that's the scary part, isn't it?
It absolutely is, especially since, you know, you look at people like Russell Williams. I mean, he was part of the Canadian Forces, right? Yeah. You think, oh, he's part of the Royal Canadian Air Force. Of course he's going to be, you know, an upstanding citizen. And yet he goes and does this completely debaucherous and horrific series of crimes. And it's like, what? I can't look at a serial killer and know exactly what I'm looking at because I never know who it is.
And I think that's the scary part.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Are there things that people can do to protect themselves? Like, for example, you know, I took part, when I was in university in the 80s, I took part of this whole series of classes called Take Back the Night. And basically it was men and women together, women, you know, telling their fears and how men could cross the street, for an example, if you see a single woman coming along the street. Are there things that we can incorporate to protect ourselves from the potential of being a victim to one of these people?
You know, you'll hear about different ways to approach that topic. You'll have people say, like, oh, there should be mandated self-defense classes, or, oh, we need to make sure that people are always using the buddy system when they're walking home at night. And I think that to an extent, you know, those common sense practices, like, yeah, if you're walking home at night, make sure that you let someone know where you're going, what time you're going to get back. Making sure that you're not, you know, wandering around bad areas, all that. But I think at the end of the day, one of the biggest things that we can do is really talk about these topics, you know, because even like serial killers aside, if you're looking at something like a woman feeling unsafe, then looking at the factors that explain why she's feeling unsafe may help other people understand the actions that they may be taking to contribute to that feeling. You know, you have that whole conversation about why catcalling is bad. And a man may think, you know, oh, I'm just complimenting a woman. But to a woman, it's an assault, verbally. And it's suggesting that she's being displayed, right? And you see kind of that,
precisely.
Yeah, you see kind of that same level of objectification in the way that a serial killer like Ted Bundy, like other serial killers that focus on a specific type of woman. They're looking for that specific angle and that specific attractiveness. And, you know, in New York, when the Son of Sam was at the height of his career, shall we say, he was going after women with long, dark hair, which actually spawned a series of women in New York cutting their hair, dyeing their hair, and doing anything to avoid becoming the next victim, right? So I think that there's always going to be common sense things that people can take, but I think that talking about these issues is the most important thing that can help get changes started.
What were the pros and cons? Your own opinion is fine right here, mm-hmm. on women doing that.
Cutting their hair?
Yeah, would you have done the same thing if you were in that milieu at that time?
You know, that's really interesting because I think that I look back at that time and I'm thinking, while I would definitely feel motivated to do that because I have dark hair, I would also feel concerned about that idea of playing into the murderer's presence in the media. Because, you know, David Berkowitz, one of the reasons that he's so well known is when he was going through New York, he became a media sensation. He became a celebrity, right? He's the one that caused the Son of Sam laws to be enacted in the States, where he penned a memoir similar to our friend Picton.
We're going to get to him in a few seconds,
Yes.
folks.
He penned a memoir, and people didn't want, of course, that book to be published and for him to get proceeds, so Son of Sam laws were enacted in order to prevent him from receiving any funds. But I think that when you have those sensations like, oh, I need to cut my hair, I need to look different to avoid the serial killer, it's also partially feeding into that serial killer's celebrity, right?
So on the one hand, you do want to protect yourself, and there's nothing wrong with that. On the other hand,
Yeah, you don't want to give him more notoriety. I think that, like,
yeah.
I think honestly that there's a difference between talking about serial killers and celebrating them and talking about ways to be safe. You know, there's a very distinct difference between those topics, especially with stateside. We have our school shootings and the argument that we shouldn't be
We have
naming.
him here too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the argument that we shouldn't be naming these killers because that celebrates their celebrity. Well, it's one thing to look back at these serial killers and to look at what made them tick and try to understand them as people. It's another thing for the media right now to go about and kind of turn modern crimes into major celebrity events.
Yeah, the media does play a huge part in all of this, don't they? And sometimes they don't use the best judgment either in what they broadcast and what they, you know, because they're always looking to beat the other person in terms of ratings and things of that. A show like we're doing right now, sometimes I get criticism that you're glorifying the killers. I certainly don't want to be in a position where I'm glorifying anything. What I want to do is educate people. And that's my whole raison d'etre in doing these shows. And certainly I suspect that's your whole raison d'etre as well when you're doing writing a column and doing your own research.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting dilemma because on the one hand, of course, I don't want to continue glorifying, quote unquote, right, glorifying these murderers and these rapists and all these different people. But at the same time, I think it's also important to honestly look at the depravity that's potentially available to mankind. I think that if we don't talk about, you know, these crimes that have existed in our past, then we're living in ignorance, and we can't do that.
www.nightfrightshow.com, folks. Once you go there, you're going to find a link to this great article that our guest tonight, Elise Torres, has written. The journal is called Crime Wire, and there's lots of great information for you there. Just click on that link. It'll take you right to a spot where you can read the articles, and everything is free. And how great is that? And you'll find out far more information than we're going to be able to cover on this show. I want to continue with this. I wanted to ask you, you know, when we do a show like this, I always worry that there's going to be some killer out there and they're going to say, oh, you know, I want to be the next person talked about through the media. And I'm always concerned with that. Any idea how many potential serial killers are out there right now, just in the United States?
Well, you know what? We actually have had a decline in the States it's a great thing, of serial killers.
Best news I've heard out of the States since the beginning of the election campaign.
I know.
I had to put some humor in there, folks, because it's a heavy subject.
You were telling me. There was a report back in 2011 published on Salon about how serial killing in the States, at least, was at its peak in the 70s and 80s. Since then, about like around the 2000s, it's actually achieved a pretty remarkable decline. I think the last numbers from 2011 were around 90 I need to look back at the article. But it was a marked decline from the numbers in the 70s and 80s. You know, I don't want to say any numbers because it's been a little bit since I looked at the article, but I think that one of the most telling parts of that study is that decline started around the year 2000, which is when the internet really started kicking off, right? An interesting relationship.
I never drew upon that correlation. That's brilliant. What's on the internet that would draw these criminals to the internet as opposed to acting out in real life?
I think that when you have a serial killer that's really heavily and aggressively hitting the media, like what we saw in the 80s, there is always inherently a level of celebrity attributed to it. And also, serial killing is something that has been so saturated in the media that even though there may still be serial killers on the loose, and there certainly are in the States and Canada as large as they are, what we really have is the hot topics now, at least stateside, are the topics of terrorism, right? Terrorists, the school shootings, the airport bombings, all of these topics that are now less so about individuals being depraved and more so about larger organizations threatening our lives and our freedoms.
You know, that's a great segue, because one of the questions I had for you later on was what would be the difference between what we would consider a criminal serial killer and a mass killer, somebody like ISIS, somebody like Hitler, Stalin, people like that. Would they be considered serial killers as well?
I think that the biggest difference between ISIS and serial killers of lore is when you have a serial killer, they're acting out of a psychological need to kill and maim, and they have those sadistic impulses, right, that motivate their decisions. But then you compare that to an organization like ISIS, and they're operating from an ideological bend.
Okay.
You know, they're operating from their interpretation of Islam, from their interpretation of the perceived assault from the West, and their interpretation is what's motivating their actions. Because if you look at the way that that Westerners are pushed into ISIS, which I actually did an article on CrimeWire about this back in December, Westerners are motivated to join ISIS because they feel isolated and they feel alone and confused, and ISIS gives them an answer and it gives them a community. So you have this big organization looking to enact its ideological virtues compared to a serial killer who's operating out of individualistic desires to kill. You know what I mean?
I do, I get it. And is there also a perversion, a sexual perversion that goes along with the typical, stereotypical serial killer as opposed to a massive group like the Nazis, Daesh, ISIS? Is that part of the element as well?
Well, you look at the way that ISIS treats their perception of sex. I think that part of specifically ISIS's and actually the Nazi regime's ideology is it carries that sense of dehumanizing others, right? So specifically for ISIS, they dehumanized a segment of I believe it's the Iranian or Iraqi. It's a minority religion. I can't remember what it's called at the moment, but their ideology justified raping and torturing and kidnapping even children in this minority. You compare that to also of course, the way that the Nazis dehumanized the entire Jewish population. And then I think there are a lot of parallels between that level of dehumanization and the way that a serial killer like Ted Bundy or like Pickton dehumanized their victims. Now, again, I think that there is a difference between the ideological motivations of an organization like ISIS to the individualistic motivations to someone like Pickton, but the essence of dehumanization is still there.
Well, you've done a great segue into Robert Pickton. Let's talk about the pig farmer from BC.
Yes.
All right. So can you start us off?
Yeah. So Pickton, he's someone that had not really hit the news too much stateside, which is why as I was researching him, I was just astounded at...
And everybody thinks Canada's so boring. Just a bunch of hockey players. Oh, no, folks. We have a whole Canadian Hall of Fame here. Trust me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that one of the most interesting parts of the Picton story, besides his memoir, is he operated between 1983 and 2002. That's a very long amount of time.
Yeah. That's a lot of heads turning the other way when they shouldn't have been, I feel. That's
No,
what
I agree, especially
yeah.
since his victims tended to be prostitutes and drug addicts
Yeah.
who, sorry to say, but they tend not to get as much of presence in police forces because partially it's difficult to report their disappearances because drug addicts and prostitutes tend not to have a permanent place of residence.
Bingo. A lot of them are transients as well.
Yeah, which makes it so hard because they already don't have contact with their families, little to none, and they could have been gone for months, maybe a year before anyone noticed.
And that's one of the reasons why Jack the Ripper did so well too with prostitutes, because nobody wanted to report them missing either.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, now this guy Robert Picton, folks, for those of you south of the border that haven't heard of this guy, he boasted when he was in jail to a cellmate that was put inside the cell as a plant, and this is often done on both sides of the border, we know that, in order to get the perpetrator to talk and get him to talk on tape, a hidden microphone. And he boasted that he had killed 49 women, and he wanted to kill one more to make it an even 50. This is the type of, I don't know what goes wrong with them, where they get these numbers from. Most Canadians grow up wanting to score 50 goals in a hockey game. This is barbaric. Not only that, when he killed the women, most of them prostitutes, he would chop them up and feed them to the pigs. Now, these pigs were in turn sold and made their way into the food chain. So we had people virtually eating people. And this is just barbaric, completely barbaric. So what makes a guy like this, what makes the officials turn the other way for so long is absolutely mind-boggling. They must have suspected something earlier on and just didn't follow up on it for whatever reasons. And anyways, just to bring you up to speed, Mr. Picton 2 days ago decided that it would be a good idea to publish a book and put it out on Amazon of his life story. Well, God love the folks in Amazon, and his publisher, he self-published, didn't realize that Robert Picton was indeed this famous serial killer in Canada, and they've pulled the book anyways.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. NightFrightShow.com.
But that is another segue to another Canadian Hall of Famer by the name of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka, better known as the Ken and Barbie Killers. Would you mind covering a little bit of their story?
Yes. So Bernardo and Homolka are quite the pair.
Oh boy.
Yeah, they operated between 1990 and 1992. So, compared to Picton, a considerably shorter murder spree, but arguably their actions were just as, if not slightly more horrific. They were married, so, capable of love. At least with each other. Bernardo had already expressed kind of inclinations toward sadistic behavior, and when he started dating and interacting with Karla, she encouraged it. So it began, reports say, with, I believe, Karla's younger sister.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty scary. And he ended up virtually killing Karla's younger sister at Christmas time. Mm-hmm. Karla had drugged her baby sister, 14 years old, I believe she was, and for Paul, because Paul had expressed an interest in having sex with her. So Karla drugged her and presented her to Paul. She had passed out, and Paul had multiple kinds of intercourse with her. And she started throwing up and virtually choked on her vomit. And they took the body to the hospital where she couldn't be resuscitated. And then Karla and Paul went home, got dressed up, and went out for Christmas dinner. There's no empathy there whatsoever. Now, is this a common trait also, at least with serial killers and murderers in general? There's just no empathy. They just don't give a darn. They just can't relate on any humanistic level with their victim.
I definitely believe that in order to ultimately take a life, you have to lack a level of empathy that would normally allow a healthy person to force themselves to stop carrying out that action, right? I mean, look at Bernardo, and he scored almost a perfect score on the psychopathy checklist, right?
I didn't know.
Yeah, so the psychopathy checklist, it was created in Canada, actually. It's a tool that psychologists can use to determine if someone is potentially a psychopath, or it's also used for other factors, like if they're like a sexual deviant or other forms of crime. So it measures the individual on different levels. Basically, it covers 20 different areas, and a score, below like a 5 is indicative of, oh, this person has no criminal background, no problem. A score of 30 or above is pretty much a clear cut, or at least a very, very likely diagnosis of psychopathy. And the factors that are involved in that include lack of remorse or guilt, exactly like we were talking about, sexual promiscuity, impulsivity, juvenile delinquency, pathological lying, all of these things that do, to an extent, match what we would think a typical serial killer, rapist, or murderer would carry. But the interesting thing about this is, reportedly, Carla scored a 5. Yeah.
And Carla's out there right now, you know that, eh?
Yeah, Carla was released in 2007, I believe.
Uh-huh. And she has 2 kids. Yeah.
Does she really?
Oh, she does. And a husband. And, oh, yeah. She had made a deal with the lawyers that she would testify against Paul Bernardo, and she would get a lighter sentence and get released earlier. So she made that deal. But her own lawyer they made tapes of all her sexual acts and murders and stuff. Her own lawyer had sat on these tapes. And once these tapes were released to the authorities, they said, oh my God, we've released the devil. And they couldn't go back because they'd already made the deal. That's the stupidity of law. Well, Canadian law anyways. But yeah, she's out there. She's got 2 kids, and I actually ran into her.
You did?
Yeah, I did. Oh, I
what
didn't know
was
it was
that
her.
like?
Well, she was pregnant at the time, and she didn't look anything like her pictures. She'd let her hair grow out and everything else, and she was huge. She's a big girl. And somebody told me after, I was standing in line at a coffee shop, Dunkin' Donuts, and they said, that's Carla Homolka, because there was a halfway house in that particular area that I'd stopped to get a cup of coffee. And the chills just went up and down my spine. But, everybody says there would be an aura around these. There's no aura, folks. That's going back to what we were saying before. There's no way of knowing who you're standing next to, even in line at a coffee shop, who these mass murderers may be or what's going on in their heads. And this is the terrifying part. Thank goodness there are some tests, as Elise has just told us. But my goodness me, without these tests, and then once they're tested, Elise, and they do come out with a 5, let's say, do we act on that right away before they start committing a crime? And this gets into that whole movie scenario that Tom Cruise and Spielberg were in, which I can't think of the name. Do we act before the crime is committed, or do we have to wait till the crime is committed and then act? So that opens up a whole new door. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown.
Yes.
What?
John Wayne Gacy.
Oh boy, what was his signature?
So John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown nickname is actually an interesting one, because he had this persona called Pogo the Clown, which in and of itself is a terrifying name. And what John Wayne Gacy would do is he was a father, husband. He was involved with charities. He was really, by all accounts, a model citizen. You know, he was exactly what you would want in a neighbor. And the clown part of his nickname actually comes up from the fact that he would dress up in his clown outfit at fundraising events and children's parties. The interesting thing about John Wayne Gacy is that his identity as a serial killer was very distinct from his identity as a clown. So he did not murder anyone when he was wearing the clown outfit. That was strictly for entertaining. But when he would go to kill someone, he had a distinctive leather jacket that he would wear. Yeah, so we call him the killer clown, but more appropriately, that killer was just John Wayne Gacy. He would sexually assault and murder teenage boys and young men. And
is that exclusively just males? Because you just mentioned he was married, and now I'm presuming with 2 kids it was to a female.
Yes. Yeah, he was married. He was, by all accounts, a heterosexual individual, and yet his signature victims were men and young boys.
And he sexually assaulted. I'm presuming there was that sexual element with these guys too, as well, right?
Yeah, and the most horrific part of John Wayne Gacy actually is that he kept the bodies in his home's crawl space. Ugh. So trophies. He would, yeah, exactly. Trophies to the extreme. And we're talking about 33 murders, 33 bodies that he would embalm in his garage for preservation, and then store in the crawl space and in the area surrounding his home. So if you think about it, you know, a man like this is probably carrying out, you know, block parties, barbecues, all these events that bring people in and around your home. And meanwhile, all of these people are standing on top of the remains of these missing men and boys.
Oh my God. And his wife had no idea this was going on.
Right. She did ultimately divorce him, understandably. Yeah.
The smartest thing she did.
She didn't have to wait, if I remember correctly, she did not have to wait for any amount of time when she requested the divorce. The judge was basically like, yeah, of course, you should have been divorced from this guy yesterday.
Now, is there a pattern that we can look at? Like most of the folks, except for Karla Homolka, we've looked at tonight, primarily are male. They're all white, as a matter of fact. Is that something that, I don't know, all these serial killers end up being, and that is white males between a certain age?
Not always. I think that I'm sure there are studies that are looking at, you know, the diversity of serial killers. I think that most studies tend to indicate that they do tend to be white males, but Rodney Alcala was he was Hispanic. He was also called the dating game killer, and for anyone not familiar with him, he was serial killer, murderer, rapist. He's called the dating game killer because stateside we had the dating game show.
Here
yeah.
too.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. And he actually appeared on the show in 1978 and won a date. Yeah. He appeared on the show. He won a date with someone.
Lucky her.
I know. Now, she actually refused to go out with him.
Thank God.
And the thing is, too, at that point, Alcala had already killed 2 women.
Oh, my God. So that could have been number 3 very easily.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Alcala, he does kind of stick out a bit when you look through like these lists of top serial killers and like the serial killers that have entered our national consciousness. He does stick out because he is not white, but there are other serial killers of other backgrounds and genders. I just think that they tend to be more in the white male category.
Is this a role model thing, do you think?
What do you mean?
Well, I'll give you an example. I'm going to go back to hockey.
Okay.
Canadian, eh? When Wayne Gretzky, who played forward on a hockey team, was at his height, every kid around, that was his role model, so they all wanted to be playing forward in the same position that Gretzky did. And I'm wondering if there could be something to that where somebody's deciding if they're going to be a serial killer or not, and they'll read up on other serial killers, and then they become the role models for them to not reenact, to emulate. I don't know. Just a thought.
Well,
I'm still trying to figure this sucker out in my head because I can't wrap my head around this. Because there's no logic to it.
I know, there really isn't. I think that that's actually a really interesting point because it brings to mind something that we actually had happen recently stateside, which you may have heard about. Los Angeles Unified School District is the largest school district in the United States, right? And there was a bomb threat, a terrorist threat, which ultimately the superintendent of LA Unified decided to shut down all LA Unified campuses for that day, which was pretty much unheard of. You know, other situations where we've had bomb threats or terrorist shooting threats, it's usually like one school will be shut down, maybe a few in an area. But the threat was ultimately determined to be a hoax it was just an email that was sent to the district's like general submissions box, and someone signed off saying that they were going to like praise Allah, and they didn't even capitalize Allah correctly. So, you know, you look at that and it's pretty clearly someone who's probably just, you know, trying to have a laugh or trying to troll the LA Unified. And the thing is, the things that they were claiming, you know, going in, shooting, leaving a bomb in a locker, they're things that have been publicized before. So I think to an extent you can have serial killers or people who are considering, you know, this life of crime could potentially look at an article like mine and say, oh, you know, I want to be like Ted Bundy. I want to be like John Wayne Gacy. But
well, one of the reasons why I asked that as well is because just like with all sports teams, you know, how you buy the cards with chewing gum in, and then you've got the card of your sports hero. Well, apparently they've got cards out now for serial killers.
Murderabilia, yes.
What the hell is going on with our society?
Yeah, it's actually, you know, eBay had to shut down the people that were selling Murderabilia because it violated their terms of service. And yeah, it's actually become a really big, thriving underground industry.
Any explanation as to why people would want a card of a serial killer such as John Wayne Gacy or a Ted Bundy?
I think that the celebrity and notoriety of a serial killer like Ted Bundy does appeal to people who are, you know, either just morbidly fascinated, like, you know, like I am, morbidly fascinated by this topic, or someone who in some way agrees with, you know, the ideological values of some of these killers, like Charles Manson, right?
Oh boy, yeah.
His entire little cult. You can look at that.
Family.
Yeah, the family, exactly. If someone were to be selling some Charles Manson T-shirt that he wore one day, you know, that would be purchased in a heartbeat.
It's funny, you know, when we had Williams here, I point over my shoulder, folks, because that's in the direction of the maximum security penitentiary here in Canada. He's been moved, by the way. It's the oldest penitentiary as well, so they've shut it down. So there's talk of them, just some trivia of making it Alcatraz North because it has this stigma around it. It was made in 1830 and, you know, even before Canada was a country. So all that to say is I had put in a request to interview Russell Williams, and when it came back, no, he didn't want to be interviewed because it's up to the individual incarcerated if they want to be interviewed or not. I was kind of happy because I thought, geez, you know, in hindsight, I don't want that guy in my head. I really don't. You know, do I need that in my life? No. So what was I thinking? You know, so uh, I was kind of happy that that took place. Now you just mentioned the closure of uh, the school in California, and that particular right at that particular time it was closed. I had a guest on by the name of Jim DiEugenio, who is friends with Oliver Stone and worked on the movie JFK, and he's my friend as well. It's not what I'm trying to say. It's just that Oliver kept calling during the show to get an update on what was happening with the schools. So I finally asked Jim. I said, Jim, I said, are you in favor of the schools closing, or would you have liked to seen them stay open? He said, no. He said, you couldn't roll a dice, so we had to close the school. You couldn't take that chance. Do you feel much the same way on that particular issue, or differently?
It's really tough because around that same time, New York Unified School District had a
That's right.
similar threat.
And they left them open.
Yeah, exactly. They chose to remain open. And I think that one of the things that may have motivated the LA Unified's decision was just around that time, there was a bunch of conversation, a bunch of hubbub about terrorist cells. We have Trump over here shouting about kicking all the Muslims out of the United States. And you have like dialogues like that. And I think that the superintendent of LA Unified would look at that and say, all right, with the dialogue that's going on right now, there's too much of a risk. Now, if I were in the superintendent's position, I don't know if I would have made that same decision because, it is a really tough one because you have that same idea of, do I feed into what the criminal wants, or do I stand my ground?
Yep, and then those are the decisions we have to make, and sometimes instantaneously. So I understand that completely.
Mm-hmm.
The worst of the worst, in your opinion?
Of serial killers?
Yeah. Okay, no, politicians.
Well,
We'll start off in the States, and then we can certainly come north. There's no worries there.
yeah, in the States, I think that the worst of the worst has to be our first, which rhymed unintentionally. In early American history, we featured the murder house that belonged to H.H. Holmes. So H.H. Holmes is, for being billed as America's first serial killer, he did a lot with that name. He, during the height of the World's Exposition in 1890, down in Chicago,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, he decided to go ahead and purchase a building that took up, it was called the Castle because it spanned 3 blocks easily. It was this vast complex. And he decided to turn it into his own murder playpen. So what he would do is actually, you look at blueprints of the house and it has strange angled hallways, staircases that lead to nowhere, rooms that look like they shouldn't belong. What he would do is have trapdoors and bells and secret hallways that would capture his victims and murder them and torture them in completely horrific ways. So you have a room that is lined with blowtorches to incinerate the victim to death. You have rooms that have only one entry point in the ceiling, so the victim would fall through and just die of neglect. Yeah, and then meanwhile, actually reminding me of John Wayne Gacy now that I think about it, while all of this depravity was going on, the second floor of his house, of his castle, was also a regular store. It was also an inn for people during the World's Fair. So it's basically the equivalent of, a mall that's also has lives ending every day.
Oh my God.
He is an interesting character.
Oh, it's awful. I had mentioned movies at the beginning of the show, 2 in particular, of course, which is the classic Silence of the Lambs, and then 7, which is, I still like to watch 7, just for the acting, not for the story so much. Have you seen the movie Room, Room?
You know, I haven't seen Room yet, but I did follow the story that it was based off of.
Yeah, it's pretty horrific as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that would be one I would recommend for folks. I think it's actually nominated for an Oscar this year. Or the actresses, I think, which I can't remember the name of. Okay, what's next for you? We're coming up to the end of the show.
You know, the next thing, I'm probably going to keep writing about serial killers. I mean, it's my side hobby. It's my secret fascination. H.H. Holmes is of particular interest to me. I really am looking forward to kind of exploring the blueprints to his home a little bit more, maybe publishing another article on CrimeWire that kind of looks a little bit more at what he did inside of his house or inside of that hotel.
Please keep me informed, because I'd love to have you back on periodically to keep people in line, so to speak, and remind them of the realities out there, because they can be terrifying. And after a show like tonight, hopefully we've brought a little bit of light to the subject, and once you shine light on something, perhaps some of the darkness will fade away to the shadows. I'm hoping, anyways. Listen, I want to thank you so much for reaching out to me all those months ago and being patient enough for a slot to come up to get you on.
Yeah, this has been great. Thanks so much for having me, Brent.
Thank you so much. Folks, our guest tonight, of course, is Elise Torres, and www.nightfrightshow.com. Her contact information will be there. She works as a journalist for CrimeWire, crime journalist. Her writing is impeccable. It's great stuff. And you're going to find out a lot more information by going to CrimeWire, and that contact information will be there as well. I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. See you all next time.
You're listening to Night Fright and your host, Brent Holland. The time is now. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Davy Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. NightFrightShow.com.